I know that
sharing for to Hiring here. See it.
I